began, as things often did in St. Erme with Penton, with a cup of tea and a mild complaint about the post. Mrs. Lavinia Harbottle, widowed these 15 years, sat at her sun-dappled breakfast table in Hollyhock Cottage, tutting over a stiff envelope she'd just opened. The handwriting was elegant and unmistakable, sloped, neat and old-fashioned, as if time itself had dipped its quill to write it. "Well, really," she muttered to no one in particular, "that woman's been dead 6 months at least." The invitation was addressed not to Lavinia, but to her former bridge partner, Miss Elspeth McGillicuddy, who had succumbed to heart failure in early March after a brisk walk that proved too bracing for her constitution. The envelope had arrived precisely that morning, postmarked the day prior, its contents pristine, an invitation to a garden luncheon at Larkspur Hall, home to the Honourer Beatrice Saville, lady of a rather diminishing fortune, but an undiminished sense of grandeur. Mrs. Harbottle pursed her lips. Beatrice was not known for gaffes. Vague, yes. Forgetful, certainly. But to send a personal invitation to a dead woman. Odd. Very odd. By mid-morning, she had phoned Beatrice. "Yes, Lavinia," came the languid voice from the other end, accompanied by what sounded like ice cubes clinking in a glass. "Oh dear, I was certain Elspeth had returned from Devon. Are you quite sure she's passed?" Lavinia, affronted, replied that not only had Elspeth died in March, but she'd attended the funeral herself. A lavender casket with silver trim and a hymn none of us could sing properly. "Oh dear," Beatrice said again, sounding flustered for once. "Well, that's rather unfortunate. I must have missed the announcement. You know how things slip past one when the lilies are blooming." There was a short silence. Then, with a curious note in her voice, Lavinia asked, "You're quite certain you wrote the invitation yourself?" Beatrice hesitated. "Well, I instructed Pamela to send them out. My niece, you know. She's staying with me a few weeks, before her term resumes at St. Agnes. Extremely helpful with household things, a very modern girl." "Modern girls don't typically invite corpses to garden parties," Lavinia said pointedly. Beatrice let out a brittle laugh. "Well, now that we've cleared up the mystery, you are coming, aren't you? This Thursday at 2. We've hedgehog-shaped. Pâté and rose champagne. Very continental." Lavinia agreed with a sigh and hung up the phone, but something niggled at her. Elspeth had been quite a presence in their little community, and Beatrice, despite her flustered protestations, would hardly have forgotten her demise. Moreover, Lavinia distinctly remembered Beatrice giving a rather long-winded speech at the funeral reception, lamenting the fragility of womanhood and misquoting Tennyson. Still, she chalked it up to one of the strange, careless lapses that happened. More frequently these days, people were too distracted, too rushed. Letters delayed, names misplaced, the dead forgotten too quickly. By the time Thursday arrived, the whole of St. Erme with Penton seemed to know about the invitation incident, and it was spoken of in hushed tones behind gloved hands and newspaper edges. Gossip rippled through the village like wind through wheat. Miss Marple, who had quietly taken a table at the luncheon beneath a wide parasol, said nothing when Lavinia recounted the story for the 5th time that afternoon. She merely tilted her head slightly, narrowed her pale blue eyes, and sipped her tea with thoughtful precision. "It is rather curious, though," Miss Marple said gently, once Lavinia had concluded. "Because, you know, I happened to be in the churchyard last Tuesday. Elspeth's grave has fresh flowers, and they weren't from the council's groundskeeper." Lavinia blinked. "Fresh? Are you sure?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple, setting her cup down with care. "Roses, pale yellow, a very personal touch." Before Lavinia could ask more, there was a sudden scream, a raw, shrill cry that shattered the pleasant hum of gossip. Every head turned toward the edge of the garden. It was Pamela, the modern niece, staggering back from the hedgerow, her white gloves stained red. "There's someone," she gasped. Someone's in the fountain. Floating, I think. It's a woman. Chairs scraped the lawn. Teacups clattered onto saucers. Lady Beatrice turned pale. Miss Marple, not rushing, rose quietly from her chair and adjusted her hat. "Dear me," she murmured, as she moved toward the chaos. Another invitation, it seems, but this one wasn't accepted willingly. The fountain was a modest one. An old stone basin with a cherub in the center who had long since ceased to spout water with any regularity. Now, its shallow pool was darkened by something that had no place in such a setting. The lifeless body of a woman, face down, her grey curls fanned out like wet lace on the water's surface. The rose-petal garnish that had been scattered earlier for decoration now drifted aimlessly around her, grotesquely beautiful. A strangled sob came from Lady Beatrice, who had tottered forward only to be steadied by Colonel Forsyth, a retired army man with a bristled moustache and stiff posture that barely concealed the shake in his hands. Pamela stood at a distance, her shoulders rigid and her eyes hollow. Miss Marple noted quietly that the girl's gloves were still on, a curious choice, given she'd just discovered a corpse. "Let no one touch anything," Miss Marple said, softly but with the quiet authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "Colonel, if you would ring the constable, please, and perhaps see that no one leaves the garden." Forsyth gave a short, stunned nod and strode off toward the house. The guests began to murmur, their carefully cultivated poise beginning to unravel. A few women sat down abruptly on wicker chairs, fanning themselves despite the pleasant weather. The vicar's wife had turned a delicate shade of green. Miss Marple moved closer to the fountain, but made no attempt to reach the body. That would be for the authorities. Her gaze was not on the woman in the water, but on the people around it. Lady Beatrice was now seated, a glass of something clear and strong in her hand. Pamela was being fussed over by a rather over-attentive young man with a deep tan and an affected accent. Philip Langston, if Miss Marple remembered correctly. A newly returned traveller from Ceylon, or perhaps it was Singapore, he made a point to mention both in every conversation. Someone whispered behind her. Miss Marple turned just enough to catch the phrase, "Who was she?" murmured between the seamstress's apprentice and the butcher's wife. The confusion was understandable. From this distance, with the face obscured, the body could belong to almost anyone. Then came the voice of Constable Baker, puffing up the gravel path in full uniform despite the heat. He was young, earnest, and utterly overwhelmed. "No one leave." "The garden," he called unnecessarily. "We'll need to, secure the area." He moved toward the fountain, eyes wide, and stopped short when he recognized the woman floating in it. His face paled. Miss Marple saw the moment recognition bloomed. She stepped beside him, speaking quietly. "You know her?" "Yes," he whispered. "That's Mrs. Cynthia Eddervane." There was a pause, then a rustle of astonishment. Miss Marple frowned. "But she's been living in Suffolk these last 5 years." "She has," the constable said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Or, she was. Though I heard she'd come back briefly last week to handle the sale of her sister's cottage. Mrs. Templeton, over on Rosewood Lane, died last month." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Cynthia Eddervane. The name was familiar. She had left the village under something of a cloud years ago. A quick, quiet departure after a scandal involving a missing sum of charity funds. It had never been proven, and the matter had quietly disappeared, but her reputation had not recovered. Her reappearance, silent and unannounced, raised as many questions as her death. Behind them, Pamela spoke for the first time since her scream. Her voice was thin and oddly flat. She wasn't supposed to be here. Miss Marple turned. "Pardon. Dear." Pamela blinked slowly. "The guest list. I wrote it myself. I would never have invited her." "She must have invited herself," Philip said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Not likely," muttered Colonel Forsyth, who had returned from the house, holding a small notebook. We had a name card for every seat at the luncheon table, neatly arranged. My own had a sprig of lavender tied to it. Very precise. He looked toward Miss Marple. Do you think she could have been trying to sneak in unnoticed? Miss Marple glanced once more at the woman in the fountain. That would depend, Colonel, on whether she intended to arrive unnoticed, or whether someone intended her to be found. A silence fell. By late afternoon, Inspector Cray had arrived from Much Benham. A compact, clean-shaven man with a perpetual air of polite suspicion, Cray was used to local deaths being accidents or arguments that got out of hand in the pub. A dead woman in a fountain at a garden party among titled ladies and cucumber sandwiches was well outside his usual purview. He questioned the guests with efficiency, though Miss Marple noted he focused more on what they had seen at the moment of discovery than on what might have led up to it. That was often the way with official police work, chasing the act itself rather than its cause. Cray eventually found his way to her, notebook in hand. Miss Marple, always helpful to have you about in cases like these. She smiled. I do. Try to be observant, Inspector. You know the deceased. Only in the way one knows most people in a village, Inspector. She had sharp opinions and a rather defensive manner. I believe she was always afraid of being accused again. Again? Miss Marple nodded. The charity fund years ago. It was never proven, but suspicions lingered. Cray scribbled something in his pad. And this business with the invitation, this mix-up with Elspeth McGillicuddy? Indeed. Odd, isn't it? One wouldn't think to confuse the two. Unless one was trying to send the invitation to Cynthia Eddervane all along, Cray said thoughtfully. Precisely, Miss Marple said. But then why disguise it? And why now? Cray looked up from his notes. You think it was intentional? I don't think anything yet, Inspector. I merely note what doesn't fit. Pamela had gone inside to lie down, escorted by Lady Beatrice and her loyal housemaid Greta. The other guests were permitted to leave by dusk, though under instruction, to remain available for further questioning. A quiet solemnity fell over the house and gardens as the constable supervised the removal of the body. Miss Marple remained a while longer, ostensibly to help Lady Beatrice settle her nerves. But her eyes, as always, were busy, the fountain now drained, the table settings untouched, the place cards still fluttering gently in the evening breeze. One was missing, not Cynthia's, not Elspeth's, but someone else entirely. It had been right there beside the pitcher of lemonade. Philip Langston's seat. Miss Marple looked toward the house where he had vanished after the constable's arrival. His jacket had been damp at the cuffs, a detail easy to overlook, unless you were paying close attention. She turned slowly and walked back toward the village, her stride slow and deliberate. Cynthia Eddervane had come back, not to visit, but to confront. Of that she was nearly sure, and someone had made certain she never left. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line as the evening shadows lengthened behind her. There were questions yet unasked, relationships yet unexamined, and somewhere, in the quiet thrum of the village's collective memory, was a motive rooted in something long buried. But not, she thought, for much longer. The village of St. Mary Mead had known scandal before, a missing brooch, a runaway maid, even a suspected elopement involving the greengrocer's daughter and a visiting pianist from Bath. But never murder, and certainly never one so theatrically cruel as drowning a woman in the ornamental fountain at a garden party. The ripples were not just waterbound. They flowed through parlours, post offices and drawing rooms with the quiet force of a rising tide. Miss Marple, though not one to court attention, found herself politely in demand. People dropped by just to see how she was keeping, always, with the faintest gleam of curiosity in their eyes. Even Miss Hartnell, who usually disapproved of gossip on moral grounds, had lingered a suspiciously long time over her inquiry about the baker's recent change in scone flour. Miss Marple's own thoughts were not on Flower or visitors, but on Cynthia Edevane, and the curious fact of her reappearance. She had returned to St. Mary Mead under no one's notice, stayed at no known lodging, and yet turned up dead at a garden party she was not invited to. And then, of course, there was the peculiar issue of Philip Langston's damp sleeves and missing place card. It was mid-morning when she ventured to the village post office, ostensibly to collect a parcel of sewing thread. Mrs. Crowley, the postmistress, was sorting letters behind the counter and greeted her with her usual cheery familiarity. "Bit of excitement at the manor, wasn't it?" she said, sliding the package across. Wouldn't have believed it if young Tommy hadn't come sprinting home from his delivery with eyes like saucers. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Quite dreadful. I only hope the inspector can make some headway." "Well, he'll have his work cut out if you ask me," Mrs. Crowley sniffed. "That Edevane woman kept to herself, didn't she? I hadn't seen her come through here. Not a post, not a parcel, not a word to say she was back. Funny that." "Very funny," Miss Marple agreed, "though I wonder if she might have sent something ahead of her arrival. A letter, perhaps. Do you happen to recall anything unusual?" Mrs. Crowley's forehead furrowed. "Now that you mention it, there was a bit of a muddle early last week. A sealed envelope with no return address, addressed to Lady Beatrice, but the writing was all slanted and odd. I meant to ask her about it, but forgot. We don't get much anonymous post here. Always seems suspicious to me." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the parcel. "Would it be terribly improper to know if Lady Beatrice received it?" "She did. I handed it over myself. I remember because she was surprised to see it and didn't open it straight away. Slipped it right into her handbag and smiled like someone who's seen a ghost." Miss Marple thanked her and walked slowly back toward her cottage, mind working steadily. An anonymous letter. A guest no one expected. A body in the fountain. If Cynthia had sent that letter, it would explain how she gained entry. But why cloak it in secrecy? That afternoon, Inspector Cray called on her. "I wondered if I might have a word, Miss Marple. You see, a few things aren't lining up the way they should." "Of course, Inspector. Do come in." He sat on the edge of her floral armchair with an air of reluctant purpose. "We've spoken with the house staff, and they confirmed that Mrs. Edevane did not enter by the front door. No one remembers seeing her arrive at all. But oddly enough, we found a footprint in the flower bed behind the fountain, a woman's heel, narrow and deep, as though she'd approached quietly." "She wasn't meant to be seen," Miss Marple said softly. "Not until she was found." "Exactly. Now Lady Beatrice is still rather shaken, but she allowed us to check her personal effects. We found the envelope Mrs. Crowley mentioned. It contained a note, no signature, just one sentence. We need to speak about what happened to Diana." Miss Marple inhaled quietly. "Diana? Cynthia's sister. Did Lady Beatrice mention it?" "She claims not to understand it. Says it must be an old acquaintance playing games. But I'm not so sure." Cray looked up. "You've lived here long enough. Did anything untoward happen with Diana Templeton?" Miss Marple paused, hands clasped on her lap. "Diana was a gentle soul. Fragile, though. Quite dependent on her sister after her husband died. There were whispers toward the end, suggestions that she had begun to believe someone was watching her, that she would find items moved in the house, letters misplaced. It was put down to melancholy, but she died very suddenly, didn't she? Gas leak. Or so it was ruled. Yes, an accident. But not everyone believed it. Her eyes grew distant. She wrote to the vicar's wife the week before she died, mentioned wanting to get out of the house. Said she couldn't sleep. Cray scribbled furiously in his notebook. "You think Cynthia returned to confront Lady Beatrice about Diana's death?" "I think," said Miss Marple quietly, that something happened in that house, something both Cynthia and Lady Beatrice knew. Perhaps Diana did too, in the end. Perhaps that knowledge was enough to get her killed. Cray looked grim. And then Cynthia came back to raise the past, and someone made sure it stayed buried. As he left, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence. A chill ran along her spine, not from fear but from recognition. It was always the small things that gave people away. A turned page, an unopened letter, a glass that had been wiped just a little too carefully. She decided to pay a call on Pamela. The girl answered the door herself, pale and startled. "I'm so sorry, Miss Marple. I won't stay long," Miss Marple assured her. "But I thought I might see how you're doing, and ask a tiny question. About the place cards." Pamela hesitated. "Yes?" "At the party, Philip Langston's card had gone missing. Was it removed on purpose?" Pamela's lips pressed into a line. "I noticed it too, but I didn't say anything." "Why not?" "Because he was so agitated," she said. "Before the luncheon. He kept saying he needed to speak to someone privately, that it was about a mistake from long ago. I thought perhaps he'd taken it himself, so no one would notice if he didn't sit at his place." "And did he speak to anyone?" "I don't know, but he disappeared just before the murder. Said he needed to make a phone call. When he came back, his jacket was wet." Miss Marple thanked her and departed with her mind whirring. Someone had secrets, many of them, but not all were about Cynthia Edevane. And if Philip Langston had returned at the exact moment Cynthia died, then he might not have been the killer. He might have been the target. But someone got to her first. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft veil, muffling the whispers and speculation that had swept through the village like a restless wind. In the quiet of her sitting room, Miss Marple sat knitting by the fire, her needlework steady, but her mind anything but idle. The threads of mystery were weaving ever tighter around the sudden death of Cynthia Edevane, and the peculiarities of that fateful garden party refused to loosen their grip. The postscript from Pamela's revelation about Philip Langston's disappearance and return with damp sleeves lingered in her thoughts. Why had he been so anxious to make a private call? What mistake from long ago could unsettle a man enough to slip away from the gathering? Miss Marple was certain that Langston's agitated state and Cynthia's untimely death were intertwined, but the precise manner was elusive, like a shadow slipping just beyond reach. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly toward the vicarage where Mrs. Jane Sedgwick had kindly agreed to receive her. The vicar's wife was a gentlewoman, known for her kindness and keen ears, qualities that often made her an invaluable source of village news, and occasionally secrets better left unspoken. Mrs. Sedgwick greeted Miss Marple warmly, ushering her inside with a hospitable smile. Over tea, Miss Marple broached the subject delicately. "I understand you received letters from Diana Templeton shortly before her death." "Yes, dear. She was quite troubled in those last weeks. More than I ever saw before," Mrs. Sedgwick replied, her eyes softening with sympathy. "She confided in me about strange happenings. Things moved about in her home, voices in the night, and the feeling of being watched. She was afraid, though she wouldn't say why. I urged her to speak to someone who could help, but she insisted on handling it herself." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And these incidents, were they recent before her death?" "Very recent indeed. She became withdrawn, even stopped attending the village meetings and church for a time. It was unlike her." "Did she mention anyone in particular?" The vicar's wife hesitated. "No names, I'm afraid. But I sensed her fear was connected to someone close to her, someone she trusted but felt was hiding something. Perhaps that is why Cynthia returned, to uncover the truth her sister could not." Miss Marple felt the first real tremor of understanding. Thank you, Mrs. Sedgwick. Your insight is most helpful. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple's path took her, past the rose garden of the manor, where the day's light caught the shimmering petals like jewels. The garden was unnervingly quiet now, the laughter and chatter of the party a distant memory. She found herself drawn to the edge of the fountain, where a faint impression in the soft earth caught her eye. She knelt, fingers brushing away a few fallen leaves to reveal a delicate gold cufflink, engraved with a small emblem nearly obscured by dirt. Miss Marple pocketed the cufflink, her mind racing. It was a man's cufflink, but whose? The staff claimed no such item had been lost, and no one had reported it missing. Yet here it was, nestled near the scene of Cynthia's drowning. That afternoon, a call from Inspector Cray invited Miss Marple to the police station for an informal discussion. The inspector's expression was grave but respectful as he shared the latest findings. "We've been speaking to everyone present at the party again," he said, pushing a folder across the desk. "Several new things have come up. First, Philip Langston's phone call was to an unknown number. He refused to say who. Secondly, we've discovered that Lady Beatrice had locked away certain letters belonging to Diana Templeton in a private desk drawer. Among them was correspondence hinting at a dispute over family inheritance." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Inheritance can kindle many fires, Inspector, but this certainly adds a new dimension." "Indeed. We also learned that Cynthia had recently been in contact with a solicitor in London, apparently to discuss the same matter. The solicitor confirmed a meeting was scheduled for the day following the garden party. That might explain Cynthia's sudden return," Miss Marple observed, "but it also suggests she believed the matter could be resolved through legal means. Yet someone clearly wanted to prevent that." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Do you believe the murder was premeditated?" "It's hard to say. The method, drowning in the fountain, was both dramatic and opportunistic. Whoever did it must have known the garden and its routines well." As Miss Marple rose to leave, Cray hesitated. "There's one more thing. The maid, Annette, mentioned seeing a figure lurking near the servants' entrance shortly before the party began. The silhouette was familiar to her, but she wouldn't say who. It's as if she's afraid. Fear can be a cage, Inspector. Sometimes people say more when they're not trying to. Perhaps a quiet conversation with Annette might reveal something." Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sought out Annette. At the manor, the young woman appeared nervous, fingers twisting a handkerchief as she answered the door. "Miss Marple," she said hesitantly, "I didn't want to say anything at first, but I saw someone last Tuesday night, just after the invitations were sent out." "Who was it, dear?" Annette swallowed hard. "I think it was Philip Langston. Did he say anything to you?" "No, he seemed agitated, pacing back and forth. When I called his name, he startled and left quickly through the side gate. I think he was meeting someone, secretly." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did you see where he went?" "No, but I heard voices, whispers in the garden. They weren't raised but angry. I didn't catch much, except someone saying, 'You'll regret this.' The words hung heavy in the air. Someone had threatened Langston, and his unease was no mere coincidence." That evening, Miss Marple sat with the cufflink on her lap, turning it over thoughtfully. She recalled the guests who had been present: Philip Langston, Lady Beatrice, Pamela, the vicar and his wife, the servants, and of course, Cynthia herself. Each held secrets, each potentially had motive. But it was the intersection of those secrets, the quiet undercurrent of resentment and fear, that formed the true puzzle. Her eyes caught the delicate inscription on the cufflink once more. The emblem was faint but familiar, a family crest belonging to the Langstons. Philip had been hiding more than just a phone call. The missing place card, his wet jacket, the clandestine meeting, they all pointed to a man entangled in his own web of secrets. And if Cynthia had come to confront him, or to reveal something he desperately wanted to keep hidden, then the tragedy in the garden was no accident. Miss Marple folded the cufflink into a small handkerchief, setting it aside. Tomorrow, she would speak with Lady Beatrice again, gently and without alarm. For now, the pieces were falling into place, but the picture remained incomplete. She rose and looked out her window at the village bathed in moonlight. St. Mary Mead had its secrets, and one among them was a deadly truth waiting to be uncovered. The morning sun filtered softly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting gentle patterns on the floor as she prepared to visit Lady Beatrice Langston once more. The gold cufflink rested carefully in a small velvet pouch, tucked inside her handbag. Its discovery had quietly shifted the course of the investigation, suggesting a far more tangled relationship between Philip Langston and Cynthia Eddervane than anyone had yet admitted. Miss Marple made her way along the familiar lane toward Langston Manor, the grand estate nestled just beyond the village's edge. The gardens were immaculate, yet there was a certain coldness to the house that morning, a heaviness that even the chirping of robins could not dispel. Lady Beatrice met her at the door, her usually composed manner showing a faint tremor beneath the practiced grace. "Miss Marple, what a surprise. Do come in." Inside, the drawing-room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. The large windows overlooked the gardens, where the fountain still gleamed quietly, now cordoned off by police tape. Lady Beatrice motioned for Miss Marple to sit and poured tea with deliberate care. "I understand you have questions," Lady Beatrice said, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Just a few thoughts, Lady Beatrice. It is such a tragic event, and I want to understand it better. May I ask about the letters you kept locked away? The ones from Diana Templeton?" Lady Beatrice nodded slowly. "They were personal correspondence. Diana and Cynthia's mother had a complicated history with the family. The letters spoke of a dispute, an inheritance that was never fully resolved. It was a sensitive matter. I thought it best to keep it private until the proper time." "Did Cynthia know about these letters?" "Of course. She was determined to settle things once and for all. She arranged to meet with a solicitor in London. I hoped it would put an end to the discord." "And did Philip Langston know of this arrangement?" Lady Beatrice's fingers tightened around her teacup. "He did. But I never imagined he would act against Cynthia." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "You say act against. Do you suspect Philip?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, then said quietly, "I do not know what to think anymore. He has been distant, troubled these past months. Yet he was always protective of the family name." Miss Marple took a moment before continuing. "I found a cufflink near the fountain last evening. It bears the Langston crest." Lady Beatrice's breath caught. "A cufflink. That could only belong to Philip. He is quite particular about his appearance." "Was he wearing a pair at the party?" "No. I noticed one cufflink was missing from his jacket." Miss Marple's thoughts shifted. "Did you ask him about the missing cufflink?" "No. I did not want to confront him while the police were investigating." Miss Marple nodded. "That missing cufflink may be a clue, one that speaks louder than words. Might I ask, Lady Beatrice, about Philip's movements that day? He was anxious. I saw him speaking quietly with Cynthia shortly before the party began, but he left abruptly, claiming an urgent call. I believed he was at the telephone box near the village shop. And was he there long? I'm not sure. When he returned, his jacket was damp and he seemed agitated." Miss Marple's mind traced the possible scenarios. Philip had reasons to meet Cynthia privately, perhaps to dissuade her or to confront her. The missing cufflink suggested a struggle or hurried departure. Yet Lady Beatrice insisted Philip's Intentions were honourable if clouded by worry. Thank you, Lady Beatrice. Your candour is appreciated. One last thing. Do you recall anyone else lingering near the servants' entrance that night? Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered with uncertainty. Now that you mention it, I did notice a figure, someone slim, wearing dark clothing, but the shadows prevented me from seeing clearly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That could be important. As she took her leave, the wheels in Miss Marple's mind turned steadily. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but a few still eluded her grasp. The day's light waned as Miss Marple visited the village shop, hoping to verify Lady Beatrice's account of Philip's phone call. The shopkeeper, Mr. Horace Gill, was a man of routine and modest demeanour, accustomed to the quiet rhythms of village life. Yes, I saw Mr. Langston there that evening, Mr. Gill confirmed, leaning on the counter. He looked quite troubled. Kept glancing over his shoulder, as if afraid someone was following him. Did he speak to anyone? No, just made the call and left rather quickly. His jacket was wet. Must have been caught in the rain earlier, I suppose. Miss Marple pressed gently. Did he mention who he was calling? Mr. Gill shook his head. No, he seemed in a hurry to be private. This confirmed her suspicions that the call was secretive and important. Next, she paid a visit to the village solicitor, Mr. James Collier, whose office was tucked into a modest brick building just off the high street. The solicitor received her with a professional yet guarded demeanour. Yes, Miss Marple, I can confirm that Cynthia Eddervane had scheduled a meeting with me for the day after the party. It was to discuss her mother's will and to possibly contest a clause that disadvantaged her family. Miss Marple probed further. Was Philip Langston involved in these discussions? Indirectly, yes. He had expressed interest in the matter, though I never met him in person. I understood there was significant tension over the inheritance. And do you think Cynthia's visit would have brought resolution or more conflict? Mr. Collier shrugged. Difficult to say. Family disputes of this nature often become quite heated. Leaving the solicitor's office, Miss Marple felt the weight of the family's hidden grievances settling upon her like a thick fog. Resentment and betrayal simmered beneath the surface, ready to boil over. Back at her home, Miss Marple carefully laid out the known facts. Philip Langston was anxious, secretive, and had a missing cufflink. Cynthia Eddervane was returning to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. Lady Beatrice was protective, but wary of her son's behaviour. The servants spoke in hushed tones of suspicious figures and whispered threats. Yet the most curious detail remained the threat Annette had overheard. You'll regret this. Who had uttered those words, and to whom? Was it a warning or a promise? The evening brought a letter addressed to Miss Marple, slipped discreetly under her door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat but hurried. The note read simply, Meet me in the garden at midnight. There is more to be revealed. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of the chase. The village's calm exterior masked restless currents, and now those currents were pulling her deeper into the mystery. She folded the note carefully and glanced once more toward the moonlit garden visible from her window. The clock ticked steadily onward, and with it, the night's secrets awaited their uncovering. The moon hung low and silver in the sky, casting long, dancing shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges of Miss Marple's garden. The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. Miss Marple, seated quietly by her parlour window, watched the darkness outside with keen eyes. The mysterious note was folded neatly on her lap, its promise of revelations both tantalizing and ominous. Midnight approached, and despite the chill that crept into the air, Miss Marple wrapped a woolen shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. Her footsteps were soft against the stone path, steady and unhurried. She glanced toward the garden bench beneath the ancient oak tree, the appointed meeting place. There was already a figure waiting, standing in the shadows, cloaked in a dark coat and hat. As she drew nearer, the figure turned, revealing the familiar face of Annette, the young housemaid from Langstone Manor. Her eyes were wide and anxious, her voice barely above a whisper as she greeted Miss Marple. "I'm glad you came," Annette said, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting to be followed. Miss Marple nodded gently. "I received your warning at the party, dear. You said you had heard something troubling." Annette swallowed, hard, then spoke hurriedly. "I couldn't say before, but there's more going on at the manor than anyone realizes. I overheard Mr. Philip arguing with someone the night before the party. It wasn't Lady Beatrice or Miss Cynthia. It was someone else. Someone I didn't recognize." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Did you hear what they were saying?" "No, not all of it. But one phrase stood out. 'You'll pay for what you've done.'" Philip sounded desperate, almost frightened. And then there was a third voice, a man's, calm but cold. "Did you see this man?" "No. He stayed in the shadows. But I heard him mention the papers and something about settling old scores." Miss Marple's mind raced. The papers could refer to the contested will or some other document hidden from public view. And old scores hinted at grudges running far deeper than mere family disputes. "Annette, did you notice if anyone else was near the servants' quarters that night?" Annette hesitated. "There was someone lurking near the back door late in the evening. A stranger, I think. He disappeared when I tried to get a better look." Miss Marple's eyes glittered with quiet satisfaction. "You have been very brave to share this, dear. But we must tread carefully now." Annette nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. "I'm afraid for my own safety. I just want the truth to come out." Miss Marple took the young woman's hand, gently. "We will see this through together." As they spoke, a sudden noise from the manor startled them, a faint creaking sound from the direction of the kitchen. Annette froze, eyes wide. Miss Marple placed a finger to her lips and motioned for silence. They moved quietly toward the source of the sound, their footsteps muffled by the garden's soft earth. A window near the servants' entrance was ajar, curtains fluttering slightly in the night air. It was not usual for windows to be left open at this hour, especially in a house as meticulous as Langstone Manor. Annette peered inside and whispered, "Someone's inside." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Stay here, dear, and be ready to call for help if needed. I shall investigate." Slipping through the open window with the ease of someone familiar with the house, Miss Marple found herself in the dimly lit kitchen. A faint scent of tobacco lingered in the air, mixed with the faintest trace of perfume, a subtle hint that the visitor was not a common intruder. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom, and she caught sight of a figure rummaging through drawers and cupboards. The person turned sharply, startled by her sudden appearance. It was Mr. Gerald Havisham, a distant relative of the Langstones who had arrived unexpectedly the previous day. "Gerald!" Miss Marple exclaimed softly. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Mr. Havisham startled, dropping a small stack of papers he had been examining. His face flushed. I was looking for something, Miss Marple. Something important." "Indeed. And might I ask what that is?" He hesitated, then said, "Old family documents. I believed they might explain some of the disputes and possibly clear some misunderstandings about the estate." Miss Marple's gaze hardened slightly. "You were searching through private papers without permission? It's urgent," he insisted. "There are things that must be uncovered if justice is to be served." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the scattered papers. Most were old deeds and letters, yellowed with age, but one envelope caught her attention. It was addressed simply to the heir in a neat, unfamiliar script. "May I see that?" she asked. Reluctantly, Gerald handed her the envelope. She slipped the seal and unfolded its contents, a letter dated nearly 30 years ago. The words hinted at a secret agreement between the Langston family and another party, one that had never been made public. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This letter could be the missing piece, an explanation for the tensions that had torn through the family like a hidden fault line. "Thank you, Gerald," she said calmly. "This changes much. I believe we must share this with the authorities and the family at the earliest opportunity." Gerald nodded, still uneasy. "I only want the truth to come out." Miss Marple led him quietly back toward the garden window. As they climbed out, she glanced toward the manor's upper windows, where a faint light burned steadily. The night air was crisp, and the mystery thickened around her like a cloak. The threats, the secret meetings, the hidden documents, they all wove a complex web that ensnared not just Philip and Cynthia, but the entire Langston lineage. Returning to the garden, Miss Marple found Annette waiting anxiously. The young woman's eyes brightened when she saw the letter. "We must be cautious, Annette. This letter will cause a stir." Annette nodded solemnly. "Do you think it will solve everything?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not yet, but it brings us closer. The answers lie not only in the documents, but in the people's hearts and fears." As dawn's first light began to pale the sky, Miss Marple felt the weight of the village's secrets settle around her. The night had offered new revelations, but also new questions. Who was the mysterious man Annette had overheard? What were the true contents of the secret agreement? And how far would someone go to keep those truths buried? The peaceful village was anything but now. Beneath its charming facade, old wounds were reopening, and Miss Marple knew that the resolution was still far ahead. Yet she remained patient, confident that with quiet observation and gentle probing, the hidden story would soon emerge from the shadows. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Miss Marple found herself back at Langston Manor, the letter still folded carefully inside her pocket. The day stretched ahead with a weight of anticipation. She knew the revelations from last night would ripple through the household, unsettling the carefully maintained veneer of propriety. Yet she also understood that patience and a delicate hand would be essential to untangle the knot of secrets without shattering the fragile peace any further. Upon entering the manor, she was greeted by the nervous bustle of servants moving quietly through the halls. The atmosphere was palpably tense, as if the house itself held its breath. Miss Marple made her way to the drawing room, where Lady Beatrice awaited her, already seated with a cup of tea in hand. The older woman's face was etched with worry lines, her eyes reflecting the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. "Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said softly, rising to greet her. "I hear there has been some disturbance." "Indeed, Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple replied. "Last night I discovered that Mr. Havisham was searching through some of the family's private papers in the kitchen. I also came into possession of a letter that may shed light on the origins of this family discord." Lady Beatrice's hands trembled slightly. "A letter? From so long ago?" "Yes," Miss Marple answered, unfolding the delicate parchment and placing it carefully on the table between them. "It speaks of an agreement made decades ago, one that has evidently remained hidden from the family until now." Lady Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes scanning the aged script. This could change everything." Before Miss Marple could respond, the heavy oak door opened and Philip Langston entered. His expression was guarded, but there was an unmistakable weariness about him. Upon seeing the letter, his eyes darkened. "So," he said quietly, "the Yada past refuses to stay buried." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "Mr. Langston, it appears that the secrets of your family's history are far more complex than previously thought. May I ask if you are familiar with this document?" Philip nodded slowly. "I had heard rumors, but no one ever showed me the evidence. I suspect that's part of why Cynthia was so determined to meet the solicitor, to uncover the truth for herself. Lady Beatrice spoke then, her voice tinged with regret. I never wanted this to come to light. The Langston name has long been protected at all costs. But at what price? Miss Marple asked softly. Family, trust, even life itself. The tension in the room was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Blake, summoned earlier that morning. His presence was a reminder that this was not merely a family matter, but an investigation bound by law and consequence. Miss Marple, the inspector greeted, nodding respectfully. I understand you have some new information. Yes, Inspector, she said. This letter may clarify the origins of the dispute, and Mr. Havisham's recent actions suggest he believes there is more to find. Inspector Blake unfolded the letter, his sharp eyes scanning the lines carefully. This references an agreement with the Edevane family, does it not? It does, Miss Marple confirmed. An arrangement that apparently excluded Cynthia from an inheritance, prompting her desire to contest it. The inspector's expression darkened. It gives motive, certainly, but it also raises questions about who else might have wanted to keep this secret. Who stood to lose the most? As if summoned by the question, the door opened once more to admit Cynthia Edevane herself, pale and composed despite the turmoil. She held a small bundle of papers in her hands, which she placed gently on the table. I have copies of my mother's correspondence, Cynthia said, her voice steady but resolute. There are letters and wills that challenge what was believed to be true. It seems the truth has been hidden in plain sight. Philip's eyes flicked toward her, the old rivalry and resentment simmering beneath the surface. Lady Beatrice cleared her throat awkwardly, sensing the tension. Miss Marple intervened with calm authority. Let us review the documents together. This is not the time for recriminations, but for clarity. They gathered around the table, sorting through the papers carefully. The letters revealed layers of deception, promises broken, and alliances forged in secrecy. The original will had been amended under suspicious circumstances, and there were indications of forged signatures and undisclosed meetings. Inspector Blake's brow furrowed. This suggests deliberate tampering. We may be dealing with forgery and potentially foul play. Miss Marple's gaze fell upon a particular letter dated just weeks before the fateful party. It was addressed to a Mr. Whittaker, a name not previously mentioned in the investigation. Who is Mr. Whittaker? She asked. Cynthia looked surprised. I do not know. The name is unfamiliar. Philip shook his head. Neither have I. Heard of him, the inspector made a note. We will need to locate this Mr. Whittaker. He may hold the key to the last days before Cynthia's death. Miss Marple was struck by the subtle tension between Philip and Cynthia, each wary of the other yet united by the shared pain of their family's unraveling legacy. The fragile truce was a reminder that beneath the surface, deep wounds remained open. After the documents were examined, Lady Beatrice spoke again. I fear this will only bring more pain. But I suppose the truth must be faced. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Lady Beatrice, and it is often in facing the truth that justice begins. The inspector stood preparing to leave for the day's inquiries. I will dispatch officers to find this Mr. Whittaker. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, I suggest you keep close to the family. Your insight may prove invaluable. As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple remained seated, the weight of the unfolding mystery pressing upon her. The letter to Mr. Whittaker was a new thread, one that promised to lead deeper into the tangled history of the Langstons and the Edevanes. The past was no longer silent, and the coming days would demand every ounce of her patience and cunning. But for now, as the morning light grew stronger, she allowed herself a moment of quiet resolve. The truth, after all, was like a patient gardener's careful tending. It might take time to bloom, but when it did, nothing could hide it any longer. The search for Mr. Whittaker began immediately, yet the village of St. Mary Mead seemed unusually tight-lipped about the man whose name had surfaced so mysteriously. Inspector Blake's men canvassed nearby towns and consulted old directories, but so far the trail was faint and elusive. Miss Marple, meanwhile, observed the household and its inhabitants with a renewed intensity, her mind piecing together every subtle gesture, every guarded word, as if the key to the entire puzzle might lie in the spaces between spoken sentences. In the meantime, the atmosphere in Langston Manor grew steadily more fraught. The villagers had caught wind of the scandal through hushed conversations at the post office and the bakery, their curiosity mingling with unease. Yet the manor itself remained sealed in a bubble of polite anxiety. Lady Beatrice did her best to maintain order, but even she could not disguise the tremor beneath her poised demeanour. Philip Langston was the first to break the surface of this silence, calling a meeting of the immediate family in the library one late afternoon. Cynthia and Lady Beatrice, along with Miss Marple and the ever-watchful housekeeper, Mrs. Plum, gathered as Philip paced slowly by the fireplace. "We cannot allow the rumours and suspicions to poison what remains of our family," he said quietly, but firmly. "The search for Mr. Whittaker is critical, yes, but we must also look inward. Secrets don't always come from outside. Sometimes they grow in the shadows within these walls." Miss Marple watched him carefully. There was genuine concern in his tone, but also a hint of something else. Defensiveness, perhaps, or a desire to redirect attention away from certain matters. Cynthia folded her hands, her gaze steady. "I agree. We all have parts to play in, uncovering what really happened to Mother, and to find out who wanted her silenced." Lady Beatrice sighed. "I only hope the truth, when it comes, does not break us beyond repair." The room fell into a thoughtful silence. Miss Marple seized the moment to gently steer the conversation. "Have you noticed anything unusual since the party? Any visitors, strangers, or changes in behaviour that seemed out of place?" Mrs. Plum cleared her throat. "There was one thing, Miss Marple. A week before the party, a gentleman called several times asking for Lady Beatrice by name. He left no message but seemed insistent. I thought it odd, but Lady Beatrice dismissed it as a mistake." Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered with surprise. "I do recall a man in a dark coat who came to the door, but I was out at the time. It must have been him." Philip frowned. "Did anyone see this man? Describe him?" "No," Mrs. Plum said. "He was always alone, and no one recognized him from the village." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "This man may well have been Mr. Whittaker, or someone connected to him. His persistence suggests a matter of some urgency." As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the library, turning over the new information in her mind. The repeated calls, the unknown visitor, it all hinted at someone with a vested interest in the Langstons' hidden affairs, someone willing to unsettle the calm facade to reach a concealed truth. Later that evening, as twilight deepened and shadows lengthened through the manor's tall windows, Miss Marple found herself in the garden, seeking the quiet she often favoured for reflection. The scent of jasmine mingled with the damp earth, the peacefulness at odds with the storm of thoughts in her mind. She was joined by Cynthia, who approached with a tentative smile. "Miss Marple, may I walk with you? There's something I want to ask, something I've been afraid to voice." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "Sometimes the simplest conversation can illuminate the darkest corners." As they strolled along the gravel path, Cynthia spoke in a low voice. "I've been wondering about Philip. We all know he wasn't close to Mother in her final years, but he seems so determined now. Do you think he's hiding something?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. "It is often the case that those who protest the loudest are trying to protect something. but the nature of what they protect can vary, sometimes guilt, sometimes fear, sometimes loyalty. Cynthia looked down, fidgeting with a stray leaf. I want to believe in the best of my family, but I fear the worst. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Trust your instincts, but hold your judgment. People are rarely all good or all bad. They are made up of many parts, some hidden even from themselves. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden noise, footsteps approaching hurriedly from the direction of the house. Both women turned to see Philip coming toward them, his face more troubled than before. I've just spoken to Inspector Blake, Philip said without preamble. They've found something at the solicitor's office in town, a package addressed to Cynthia, sent from Mr. Whittaker himself. Cynthia's eyes widened. A package? What kind of package? Philip shook his head. They won't say yet, but it seems important enough that they called it to my attention immediately. The police plan to retrieve it first thing in the morning. Miss Marple's mind raced. The mystery deepened, and the threads of the past were pulling tighter around the present. As they returned indoors, the household seemed to hold its breath. The wait for the package's arrival was an anxious one, filled with whispered conversations and uneasy glances. Each person seemed to wrestle silently with their own fears and suspicions. When the morning came, Inspector Blake arrived promptly, with the evidence. The package, wrapped in plain brown paper and sealed with a wax emblem, was carefully opened in the presence of the family and Miss Marple. Inside lay a bundle of letters, photographs, and a small diary, all belonging to one, Samuel Whittaker. His handwriting was neat, precise, and unmistakably personal. The diary chronicled a series of meetings and correspondences with members of both the Langston and Edevane families, revealing a tangled web of promises, betrayals, and long-buried debts. Miss Marple's eyes settled on a particular entry dated just days before the fateful garden party. It spoke of a planned confrontation, a warning to certain family members, and a veiled threat that hinted at grave consequences should secrets be revealed. The past is indeed stirring, Miss Marple murmured, and the shadows it casts are long. The room fell into silence, each person grappling with the weight of the newly uncovered truths. The mystery was far from solved, but with every revelation, the hidden threads began to form a clearer picture. Miss Marple understood now that the invitation sent to a dead woman was but the opening move in a much larger, more dangerous game. And as the pieces moved inexorably forward, the true nature of the crime and the criminal would soon emerge from the darkness. The atmosphere in Langston Manor had shifted palpably with the arrival of the diary and letters from Samuel Whittaker. The revelations within those fragile pages seemed to hang like a heavy mist over the household, unsettling the calm facade the family had so carefully preserved. Each person present grappled with the weight of the secrets exposed, though none, more so than Miss Marple, whose keen mind sifted through every detail, every nuance, seeking the final pattern to unlock the mystery. The entries in the diary were telling, not merely of business dealings and social entanglements, but of betrayals so deep and personal that they would stain the reputations of those involved forever. Whittaker's words were often cautious, guarded, but occasionally they slipped into a tone of desperation, especially in the days leading to the garden party. He hinted at blackmail, old debts unpaid, and a reckoning that was long overdue. One particular passage caught Miss Marple's attention. It described a meeting scheduled with an unnamed member of the Langston family, a meeting that Samuel intended to use to settle scores and reveal truths. The entry was dated just 2 days before Mrs. Edevane's death. "Philip," Miss Marple said softly, "does this coincide with anything you remember from that time?" Philip frowned, rubbing his temple as if trying to ward off a headache. "I remember Mother seemed distracted, more anxious than usual. I assumed it was related to some family business, but I had no idea it was this serious." Cynthia, who had been silently listening, spoke up. Mother never told me about any meeting with this Mr. Whittaker. If she knew something so dangerous, why wouldn't she have confided in me? Lady Beatrice shook her head. Some things, my dear, are kept secret to protect others, or perhaps to shield oneself from shame. Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed. But it is often those very secrets that lead to the most tragic outcomes. Inspector Blake, who had been observing quietly, now leaned forward. This diary provides a motive, certainly, but we still lack the concrete evidence that links any of the family members to the crime itself. Motives can be hidden in the smallest gestures, Miss Marple replied, and sometimes the most convincing evidence is found not in what is said, but in what is left unsaid. She looked around the room, her gaze resting on each person in turn. I believe it is time for a frank conversation, one where no detail is too trivial and no question too uncomfortable. Over the next several hours, the family members were gently but persistently questioned, their stories weaving a tapestry of interlocking relationships and concealed grievances. Philip admitted to strained dealings with his mother over her management of the estate. Cynthia revealed her suspicions of long-standing tensions between Lady Beatrice and Mrs. Edevane, dating back to an inheritance dispute from years ago. Lady Beatrice herself spoke cautiously, hinting at past mistakes and misjudgments, but steadfastly denying any involvement in the recent tragedy. Mrs. Plum, the housekeeper, offered small but telling observations about the late Mrs. Edevane's mood in the weeks before her death, how she had grown withdrawn, perhaps fearful. Miss Marple listened with her usual patience, noting inconsistencies in tone and body language. It was not the loud accusations that drew her attention, but the fleeting expressions, the hesitations, the subtle shifts of eye contact. In the quiet moments after the interrogations, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the enigmatic figure of Mr. Whittaker himself. Who was he really? What was his connection to the Langstons, and why did his involvement appear so secretive? Her questions found some answers when late that afternoon a telegram arrived for Inspector Blake. It bore news from London that confirmed Mr. Whittaker's identity as Samuel Whittaker, a solicitor who had recently been disbarred under mysterious circumstances. More intriguingly, it mentioned a pending investigation into his affairs, suggesting a man caught in legal and financial troubles. This revelation cast a new light on the entire case. It seemed Mr. Whittaker was not merely a messenger of truth, but a man whose own secrets threatened to consume him. The letters and diary entries were not just cries for justice, but perhaps desperate attempts to salvage his reputation, or to manipulate the Langstons for his own ends. Miss Marple pondered these developments as she sat by the window overlooking the gardens. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawns, mirroring the darkening suspicions that had enveloped the household. Suddenly, a thought struck her, a detail she had not yet shared. "Inspector Blake," she said, standing and gathering the diary in her hands. "May I suggest we look again at the invitation itself? The one sent to Mrs. Edevane, the letter that brought this whole tragedy to light." Blake nodded, intrigued. "Go on, Miss Marple." "That invitation was not sent lightly," she continued. "It was a deliberate act. Someone knew Mrs. Edevane would receive it and attend the gathering. But consider the timing and the contents of Mr. Whittaker's diary. The invitation may have been a catalyst designed to provoke a reaction, to bring certain truths to the surface." Inspector Blake furrowed his brow. "Are you suggesting the invitation was a trap?" "Not necessarily." "A trap," Miss Marple answered. "More a challenge, perhaps. A test to see who would reveal themselves under pressure." The inspector looked thoughtful. "If that is the case, who stands to gain the most from such a test?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That, Inspector, is the question we must answer. The Evening deepened, and as the household settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple's mind remained alert, piecing together the final fragments of a complex puzzle. The threads of loyalty, betrayal, fear, and desperation wound ever tighter, but she was confident the knot would soon be undone, and when it was, the truth would be as startling as it was inevitable. The following morning dawned grey and still, the kind of sombre day that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Miss Marple, ever methodical, rose early and settled in the library of Langston Manor, the diary and letters spread carefully before her. She reread passages with a growing sense of clarity, her fingers tracing the faded ink as if coaxing secrets from the paper itself. Outside, the garden was silent, but inside, a quiet storm was gathering. Inspector Blake arrived promptly, his usual brisk demeanor tinged with exhaustion. "I've been reviewing the statements again," he said, settling into a chair opposite Miss Marple. "And I must admit, the more I read, the less clear the picture becomes. Everyone seems to have a motive, yet no one leaves a trace. That is often the way in these cases," Miss Marple mused. "Human nature is not as straightforward as it appears. People hide behind facades, even from themselves. But it is the small details, those overlooked in haste, that tell the true story." Blake nodded, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "You mentioned yesterday that the invitation might have been a deliberate provocation. I can't get that idea out of my head. It makes me wonder who would want to draw Mrs. Edivane back into the fold, knowing it might unsettle her and others." Miss Marple smiled gently. "An astute observation. And yet, we must consider who benefits from the unrest that followed." The inspector's eyes flickered with the faintest hint of surprise. "You mean beyond the obvious?" "Precisely," she replied. "Mrs. Edivane's death was not an isolated event. It was the climax of a series of tensions long simmering beneath the polite surface of this household. Someone sought resolution, whether through reconciliation or retribution is yet to be determined." As they spoke, the door opened quietly, and Cynthia Langston entered, her face pale but composed. "If I may," she said softly, "there's something I discovered that might be important." Miss Marple gestured for her to continue. Cynthia hesitated, then produced a small bundle of papers tied with a ribbon. "These were among my mother's personal effects, letters she had hidden away, correspondence between her and a man named Edward Mallory." Blake's brow furrowed. "Edward Mallory? I don't believe he was mentioned before." "No," Cynthia admitted. "Mother never spoke of him, at least not to me. But these letters suggest a relationship, more than professional, less than scandalous, but certainly significant." Miss Marple took the letters carefully and began to read. The tone was intimate, yet cautious, a dialogue fraught with uncertainty and veiled references to shared secrets. There was mention of debts, threats, and a desire to keep certain facts from the public eye. The final letter was dated just a week before the garden party. "This adds a new dimension," Miss Marple observed. "It seems your mother was entangled in matters beyond the family's knowledge and with someone outside the immediate circle." "Could this Edward Mallory have had reason to wish her harm?" Blake asked. "Possibly," Miss Marple replied. "But I suspect the truth is more complicated. Often the danger lies not with the outsider, but within the walls we call home." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Plum entered, her expression troubled. "Miss Marple, Inspector, there's been a discovery in the West Wing." Together, they followed her through dim corridors to a small room that had been sealed since the investigation began. There, on the floor near a dusty cabinet, lay an old photograph album, its cover worn and cracked. Cynthia picked it up reverently and opened to the first page. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly as she recognized some faces, ancestors of the Langston family, posed solemnly in sepia tones. But it was the photograph tucked inside the back cover That drew a gasp from Cynthia. The image was of a young woman bearing a striking resemblance to Mrs. Edevane, but dated nearly 50 years prior. On the back, a faded inscription read, Eleanor Langston, 1928. Eleanor, Lady Beatrice, whispered, appearing at the doorway. That was my grandmother, and Mrs. Edevane's mother. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. This changes much. The roots of the current troubles run deep, intertwined with family history and long-buried grievances. As the day wore on, the house seemed to grow heavier with secrets. Conversations became guarded, glances exchanged like silent warnings. Yet Miss Marple remained calm, her presence a quiet anchor amid the storm. She gathered the family in the drawing room as dusk settled outside. I believe we are nearing the heart of this mystery, she began, her voice measured. But to reach it, we must confront truths both uncomfortable and long suppressed. One by one, she recounted the key discoveries, the diary's revelations, the mysterious Edward Mallory, the hidden letters, and the photograph connecting past and present. Her words were gentle but firm, weaving the disparate threads into a coherent narrative. And so, she concluded, the invitation was no accident. It was a summons, not just for Mrs. Edevane, but for all of you, to face the consequences of choices made decades ago. There was a murmur of unease among the group, but Miss Marple's eyes rested on Philip Langston. There is one final question that remains. Who stood to gain the most by silencing Mrs. Edevane before those truths could emerge? Philip swallowed hard, his composure faltering for the first time. I don't know. Miss Marple smiled gently. That, Mr. Langston, is precisely what we intend to find out. As the night deepened, she prepared to put her plan into motion, a subtle test to draw out the true culprit, using nothing more than observation, patience, and the unerring understanding of human nature that had solved so many mysteries before. The game was nearly over, and the final move was hers to make. The evening air hung heavy with anticipation as the household settled into an uneasy quiet. Miss Marple sat by the fireplace, her knitting resting forgotten on her lap, eyes alert beneath gentle brows. The subtle psychological game she had orchestrated was about to reach its climax. She had invited the family and close acquaintances to the drawing room under the pretense of discussing new findings. Quietly, she had observed each person's demeanor, their mannerisms, and the faintest flickers of expression that betrayed inner turmoil. It was in the small things, a nervous glance, a tightening of the jaw, the involuntary clutching of a handkerchief, that the truth would emerge. Thank you all for gathering, Miss Marple began softly, her voice calm and disarming. There is one more piece of the puzzle that must be addressed before we can lay this matter to rest. Her gaze settled on Philip Langston, whose earlier composure had waned like a candle flickering in the wind. Philip, she continued, you have been steadfast in your assertions, yet your reactions betray a deeper involvement. The letters discovered reveal a connection not only between your late mother and Edward Mallory, but hint at pressures you might have faced yourself. Philip's face paled, but he said nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward, the firelight dancing across her serene features. The invitation to Mrs. Edevane was indeed a summons, but not one meant for reconciliation alone. It was a catalyst designed to unearth secrets that some wished to keep hidden at all costs. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Your financial troubles were grave, and Edward Mallory, with his relentless demands, posed a threat. Mrs. Edevane's return threatened to expose matters that could have destroyed your standing. In desperation, you acted. Philip's eyes darted around the room, finally settling on his mother's photograph with a mixture of regret and resignation. It was not murder in passion or anger, Miss Marple said gently, but a cold, calculated act, a misstep to silence a voice that would have undone you. The room was still except for Philip's quiet confession and the crackling fire. Inspector Blake stepped forward, placing a firm but understanding hand on Philip's shoulder. "It's over now, Philip." As the family absorbed the revelation, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through the room, relief mingled with sorrow. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her dress. The shadows of the past often linger longer than we expect. Yet, it is only when light is cast upon them that healing may begin. Later, as the household began to settle back into their routines, Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing out at the peaceful village beyond. Despite the day's dark revelations, she found solace in the enduring rhythms of human nature, the capacity for secrets, for forgiveness, and for understanding. The mystery had been solved, but the true work, as always, was in the delicate balance of justice and compassion. And with that thought, Miss Marple turned away, ready for whatever new puzzle might next cross her path.